Para nosotros es un gusto y un placer tener aquí con nosotros a Adrian Martin, que es una de las voces más importantes de la teoría y de la crítica de cine contemporáneo a nivel internacional. Es crítico de cine, de arte, es también ensayista audiovisual, nació en Australia, actualmente reside en España. Es también profesor de la Elias Querejeta Cine Escola, profesor adjunto en la Film and Screen Studies de la Monash University en Australia. Es autor de incontables reseñas, columnas, críticas y de libros como Filmakers Thinking, Mysteries of Cinema, Mise en Scène and Film Style, Last Day Every Day, que es el cine moderno, The Mad Max Movies, el librito de Once Upon a Time in America para el British Film Institute, Phantasms, la lista sigue, Mutaciones del cine contemporáneo, editado con Jonathan Rosenbaum, editado en España en el Rato Natura, si no me equivoco, y también realiza audiocomentarios para los ensayos más importantes de DVD y de Blu-ray, como Arrow, Masters of Cinema, Criterion y demás. Entonces, sin más, le doy la palabra a ella. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay. Thank you, Miguel, and thanks to the University of Granada. When Miguel told me some of the interests and research topics that were part of this conference, I realised I could bring together for you a number of strands of my own life, my own experience, my years still going as a film critic, my long time interest in fiction or narrative across media, transmedia, and also my involvement back in the 1990s with experimental theatre in Australia. And I watched a lot of experimental theatre work at that time, which came under different names: New Theatre, Theatre of Images. And thanks to Miguel, I realised that a lot of this work, of course, has been discussed in more recent years under the term the post-dramatic, in relation to Lehmann's book about post-dramatic theatre. And I went and asked my Australian friends from the 90s, well, did you ever read this book? Like, did this book ever come to you? And they said, yes, we memorised this book when it came out. We taught it in all of our experimental theatre classes, not just theory but practice as well. So film, theatre and fiction are these explorations that I'm doing today. So I'm going to start with a phenomenon that I've noted, a recent phenomenon, which is filmmakers talking about how they really want to escape, subvert or destroy narrative. Now, I don't mean experimental or avant-garde or independent directors like Jean-Luc Godard or Apichat Pong. I'm talking about Martin Scorsese. I'm talking about these very mainstream commercial directors who make films with multi-million-dollar budgets. But they talk often about how they don't like narrative. And I thought this was an interesting thing to investigate. Now, let me see if this works. Why isn't this working?
You have to click.
I'm clicking.
But the mouse pad.
Will it work now? Oh, yes, okay. And the video is covering it a bit there, but the most famous comment, I would say, by any filmmaker along these lines is Stanley Kubrick. And Kubrick in 1987, he had just made Full Metal Jacket. And he didn't give many interviews, but he loved to talk to one Frenchman, Michel Simon, for Positif magazine. And this is what Kubrick said. He started one of his rambling comments by saying that he envied the freedom of people who were making TV commercials, TV advertisements, because he said they were free to use unconventional camera work, for instance. He said that if a person is talking, you don't have to point the camera at them, you can point the camera somewhere else. And he thought commercial makers, advertisement makers had this freedom. And then he dramatically added this statement in English. The real explosion will come in cinema when someone finally liberates the narrative structure. A weird statement, right? Someone, a hero, is going to liberate narrative for us. Now, when Simon translated that into French, he gave it a slightly different meaning. His French translation had it as Kubrick saying, I want to make the narrative structures explode. I want to blow up the narrative structures, or I am blowing up the narrative structures in Full Metal Jacket, that film. It's not exactly what Kubrick said, right? But note the implication of what Kubrick did say, that we are imprisoned in narrative, right? We've got to break out of the prison of narrative. Now, some other examples, and I literally have just randomly collected these online. Steven Soderbergh. I'm frustrated with the tyranny of narrative. I'm convinced there's a new grammar out there somewhere, a new grammar. If I'm going to solve this issue, it means annihilating everything that came before in cinema and TV and starting from scratch. A modest guy, Soderbergh. He's going to personally annihilate everything and start from scratch for our benefit. Like with Kubrick, you wonder, what has Soderbergh been watching for the last 30 years? You know, like, they're not referring to the films of Godard, they're not referring to the Nouvelle Vague, the Polish New Wave, the Japanese New Wave. They're not referring to anything that really has attacked or questioned narrative. Their frame of reference is really still Hollywood. It's still the mainstream, commercial, classical narrative film. Wim Wenders made this cryptic statement. The question, how do I come up with something new? Doing a remaking a previous film, is not storytelling. It's like repeating a story that has already been told. My only desire is to find out how to tell the story and then forget about the story. So he needs a story, then he'll work out how to make it into a film, and then he can forget about the story. Recall that Wenders spent many years very suspicious of stories. And he once said, this is way back in the early 70s, all narratives are death. All stories end in death. That was Wenders' original position. And then he kind of started to feel, well, I should start telling stories about angels and other things, and he sort of found his way to storytelling. But he's ambivalent about it, right? Martin Scorsese. I want to make another film about Jesus Christ, because he's already done one, The Last Temptation of Christ. I want to make another film about Jesus Christ. I don't know what it's going to be exactly. I don't know what genre you'd call it, what genre you would put it in. It wouldn't be a straight narrative, but there would be staged scenes, and I would be in it. Having seen a number of films that Marty acts in, I have some worries about this. However, we shall wait and see. Now, most interesting for my purpose today is the comments of Jerzy Skolimowski, a filmmaker that I absolutely rate very, very highly. And many of you will have seen his film, Io, about a donkey that was released last year. Skolimowski said, my partner, Eva Piaskowska, and I were so fed up with linear narration, because practically all films keep the same structure. Telling the story from the beginning, the end, with the 3-act structure. I think the audience, not only myself, but the general audience, could be quite bored with it. So he's saying traditional narrative is boring. We were thinking, he and Eva were thinking, how do we get away from it? We already tried a little bit in 11 Minutes, this film that he made in 2015, in which we only partially succeeded, but at least we made the first step into that direction. Now let me quickly describe 11 Minutes to you, because it's a film that has not been seen very much. 11 Minutes is a film which is about 11 minutes of story, repeated 8 times. But each time we see a different part of an interconnected scene. So for one part we see people up on a high-rise building. For the next 11 minutes we see 2 people arguing in the street. For another 11 minutes we see a show of clowns that's going on at the end of the street, right? And then of course by the end of the film we see how all those stories interconnect in the same 11 minutes. That the person on the top floor drops a thing which hits the couple, which affects the clowns, and so on and so forth. And in fact it's quite apocalyptic how it all comes together in 11 minutes. So that was what Skolimowski rather strangely said was his first attempt to question narrative. In fact, Skolimowski had been questioning narrative since at least 1965 in his work. If you see his film Barrier, absolutely brilliant film, it's already a completely surreal narrative that obeys few rules and conventions. However, Skolimowski got onto this thing of he wants to break apart narrative. So back to EO, he says, then we thought that perhaps if we tell the story with an animal as the main character, a donkey, there could be a new kind of way of narrating the film, of telling, of showing the film. At least we will get rid of the solid chunk of dialogue. So the donkey doesn't talk, right? We'll get rid of the solid chunk of dialogue, which is the most boring part of any film. Okay, so that's the way that Skolimowski and Piskovska went into that project. Now, we can't get rid of Guido here?
Yeah.
I feel imprisoned by Guido. That's good, that's good. So, let's assume that these directors are sincerely trying to challenge, to push at the limits of narrative, of conventional narrative. How do they do that? Okay, Full Metal Jacket, which I'm sure many of you have seen. The film is structured very unusually into 2 halves, 2 distinct halves. And this is, I think, what Michel Simon was thinking when he translated Kubrick as saying, oh, I want to blow apart the narrative structures. Right? So the film is in 2 halves that are disconnected. The first half is training of soldiers, and the second half is the soldiers in combat in Vietnam. The first half of the film, particularly, which I think is the better half of the film, is based on relentless repetition of the same situation, of the trainer yelling at the soldiers, brutally, sadistically, humiliating them. And the second half is fighting the Vietnam combat. And so there's a lot of this rigid Kubrick-style front-on geometric frames and so on. And both halves build to, once again, a kind of apocalyptic shock, like in 11 Seconds by Skolimowski. The first half of the film ends with the suicide of a soldier, and the second half ends with the revelation that a crack sniper on the Vietnamese side is a woman. That's the sort of shock revelation in the film. So that's the way Kubrick is sort of challenging or pushing at the limits of narrative. What about why isn't this working? So I just have to click on it, do I?
Yes.
Oh, that's not what I wanted. Yes. Okay, here. So even more than Full Metal Jacket, it is an extremely episodic film. Episodic meaning not all parts of the film easily fit onto the next one. There are few connections, few connective explanations about how Eo the donkey arrives at one place or another, or how he got out of one place or another. How many years are covered in the film? None of this is explained, right? So it's an extremely episodic structure. I would say even to the point of a certain kind of dissociation. There's a kind of feeling of madness, of disconnectedness in the film, which comes from this narrative structure. However, like Robert Bresson's famous film about a donkey, Balthazar, or Hussar Balthazar, which was the film that inspired Skolimowski. He said it was the only film that made him forget he was watching a film. Balthazar is the only film that had that effect on him in his life. So it's a sort of a homage, but it's very different to Bresson's film. But like Bresson's film, it's a kind of in Bresson, it's birth to death of a donkey. In EO, it's more like youth to death. So there's that kind of life, bio sort of chronology to it. Now, a Soderbergh film, let's take an example, The Limey, made in 1999. So Soderbergh's film is a revenge story. It flashes back through the biography of the main character, played by Terence Stamp. And inside each scene there are many fast-cut, unusual details, angles, inserts, objects. In fact, very much like a television commercial. That's the way Soderbergh was directing at that time. However, there's a major novelty in this film, a major unusual thing, which is that whenever there's a flash of the character's past, it's footage from an older film. It's a film called Poor Cow by Ken Loach, a British film. And we see flashes of Terence Stamp in 1967 cut into the 1999 film, as if they're the same person. But of course the character in Poor Cow is not the character that's in The Limey. Right? So Soderbergh's done this very clever thing of, rather than trying to fake up Terence Stamp looking like a 20-year-old, he simply uses the footage of Terence Stamp 20 years old from another film. So now I come to the more theoretical bit, which is Hans Lehmann's concept of the dramatic and the post-dramatic in his book Post-Dramatic Theatre. And I asked myself whether these notions of Lehmann, his definitions of the dramatic and the post-dramatic, can help us evaluate these narrative transgressions or this pushing at the limit by Kubrick, Soderbergh, Skolimowski and so on. And I'm referring here to the book Post-Dramatic Theatre. So for Lehmann, and this is sort of boiling it down, but I think this is the essential argument of Lehmann in his book. The conventional drama, which of course can also be a comedy, it's not just dramatic drama, it's not just serious drama. The conventional drama is defined by three major things, three major aspects. First, a story, a plot, a narrative. Now, I know all good narratologists have many, many terms to distinguish between story, plot, narration, action, history, discourse, etc. But we're not worrying about that today. We're just saying a plot, the way anyone would say the story of that film is, the plot of that film is, the narrative of that film is. So the first major aspect is a story. A story is told in a film. Secondly, and this is very important, the actors bring characters to life. They bring individual characters to life from what Lehmann calls a role script. In other words, the script of the play or whatever screenplay for a film gives them a character to play, an individual character. And this is the process that he calls mimesis or imitation. So the actor becomes the character. And indeed, you know, to talk to most actors, that's what acting is. You become a character. You get inside a character. This is very different to post-dramatic acting. For instance, in the autobiography of the French actor Boule Augier, who worked with Rivette, who worked with Buñuel, who worked with everybody. And Manuel de Oliveira, she worked with everybody. And in her autobiography, which is called I've Forgotten, a wonderful title for an autobiography. In her autobiography, she says what she learnt from Louis Buñuel, working on Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie with him. What she learnt from him is that you don't have to play a character. You can play less than the character, and you can play more than the character. And what that means is you can subtract the sort of psychology and the inner motives. You can take out some of the interior work, but then you can exaggerate other aspects of the character, such as their appearance, their dress. And Boule was famous for doing her own costumes for her roles, right? The hat she wore was more important to her than the inner psychology of the character, right? So she says she can play more than a character and less than a character, and Buñuel taught her how to do that. We'll come back to this question of bringing characters to life, so it's very central. And thirdly, there is a world. The fiction creates, implies a world, a fictional world. We call it in film studies the diegesis, and it is perceived as a totality. The illusion of a coherent world holds. Now, these days, in the sort of digital media landscape that we're in, people are obsessed with this notion of world building, right? If you do a video game based on Lord of the Rings or whatever, you're going to reconstitute the world. You're going to expand the world, build the world of Tolkien's fiction, right? And this is the kind of thing that Lehmann's talking about. And for him, even in a stage play where there's 2 chairs and a table and 3 actors, there is still, it can be, the illusion of a coherent world. And this is another important thing I'll come back to. Lehmann also notes a characteristic structure or shape of conventional, classical, dramatic narrative, and it's this: exposition, introduction, ascending action, the action, the plot takes off, peripeteia, meaning various diversions and developments of the plot, and finally, catastrophe, or maybe it's a happy ending, but it could be a catastrophe, like in Chernobyl. Now, these, and Lehmann says, these are what people expect of an entertaining story in film and theatre. They expect those aspects of a narrative structure. Now, how to define, on the other hand, the post-dramatic? And this, of course, is Lehmann's theory of the new theatre. But we can apply a lot of this to film, to a certain degree, and I'm going to talk about that degree in a little while. So firstly, the post-dramatic is a series of negations of the dramatic. You've got to negate, you've got to cut off the dramatic. You've got to break apart or dissolve the plot. You've got to free the actors from performing individual characters, from doing the role script. You've got to abandon or unmask the illusion of the world, of the fictional world, the homogeneous, unified fictional world. And then, so that's the negation. And then second, there are, on the more positive side, there are a series of new aesthetic strategies that come with post-drama. What he calls the non-hierarchisation and the montage of elements. So a typical piece of new theatre that I would watch in the 1990s in Melbourne, Australia, where I grew up, it would be kind of a montage of things. Someone in the corner playing a piano, somebody comes in dressed as a World War II soldier and recites a speech, then suddenly a screen begins projecting images of another decade, another time altogether, right? So the work is a montage. You don't look at it and say, yes, it's all happening in 1945, it's all part of the same world. It's not. It's a free-floating montage in a non-hierarchy. The text, the actor, the set, the decor, and the screens. Of course, screens became an important part of post-dramatic theatre. Lehmann stresses in post-drama there's the overwhelming presence of the actor's body and the actor's voice, not as a character, right? But as, in a sense, themselves, or simply as their material performance, what they do with their body, their gestures, what they do with their voice. And that is a new kind of spectacle for theatre. There is what he calls the plotless work. It could be a theatre of images. This was a phrase that was very popular in Australia, the theatre of images. Pure images, like in the work of Richard Wilson in America. Or he talks about there could be a dream logic. What happens on stage could be like the phases of a dream with no evident connection one to the next. He says that the overall form of the work, of the way the parts interrelate, is more important than the content, in the sense of summing up the content with a theme or a subject. It's the form of the montage that matters. And there's a lot more in Lehmann's book, but there's some of the key things that I wanted to pull out for you today. So, coming back to our original examples, Full Metal Jacket, EO and the Limey. Are they new narratives? Now, I think to some degree, those filmmakers would think they're kind of making a new kind of narrative, but are they? That's the question. Full Metal Jacket, it uses two different parts. It deviates a little from traditional narrative structure. It stylises its depiction of events through cinematography, through the rhythm of the editing and so on. EO, as I said, is confrontingly episodic, sometimes hard to make sense of. It has a mysterious plot structure. It's intensely poetic and lyrical in its imagery and its almost overwhelming music score that runs almost completely through the film. And as Skolomovsky was very proud of, it has an animal point of view, not a human point of view, but a donkey's point of view. When he accepts awards for this film, he always says, he's a very honest guy, that he preferred the animal actors to the human actors. And he went on to thank all of the donkeys by name. Oh, what a guy. The Limey by Soderbergh. Now, like Kubrick, it's an extremely stylised depiction of this revenge story, and it has this jazzy editing and montage of images and sound. As I said, it mixes two heterogeneous films, his own, The Limey, and The Poor Cow by Ken Loach. However, but here's where we hit the limit of the experimentation. All three films ultimately tell a classical story with a start and an end. They feature actors playing roles and multiple donkeys playing a role, the role of EO. They conjure a coherent, fictional, homogeneous world. Even if that world is sort of scattered and strange in the Skolomovsky film, even if it's violent and brutal in Kubrick, even if it's fragmented in Soderbergh, it's still a coherent, homogeneous, fictional world. Also, in Lehmann's terms, these three films offer the illustration of an action laden with suspense. And he doesn't mean suspense in the Alfred Hitchcock sense, he means suspense in the more ordinary sense of you want to know what's going to happen next. You want to know the next step in the story, and you want to know the final outcome of the story. Will EO survive? What will happen to the soldiers, the American soldiers in the Vietnam War, and so on. So, there are many filmmakers who, despite their intentions and despite their stated frustrations, are not really managing to break out of the old or the straight narrative ways. And I think this is even truer of contemporary TV series. If I understood Domingo's intervention well in the last panel, Black Mirror deals with, the digital world, but often tells a very normal, straight story about the digital world. In itself, in its own form, Black Mirror episodes are really quite ordinary, no matter what they are talking about, right? No matter what their content is. Even Twin Peaks: The Return. Now, God knows I love Twin Peaks: The Return. And like many of us, I watched it absolutely hypnotised each week, as it rolled out. And as it rolled out, I was thinking, I have never seen anything so radical on television, so weird, so disconnected, so, it seemed, post-dramatic. But of course, by the very end of Twin Peaks: The Return, everything kind of makes sense. It makes sense within the multiverse, within parallel timelines, parallel worlds, and all the rest of it. But it does make a kind of narrative sense. Even if it rewinds and restarts its own story, it makes a sense within its own sort of cosmic world. So even the famous episode 8, which, just sort of starts in outer space, as it were, even that becomes part of the cosmic world of the film. And this idea, which is very fashionable now, of the multiverse, is in a way, one way of limiting narrative, of bringing narrative back into a built world. Now, is there a limit to layman's theatre-based theory for helping us analyse audiovisual media such as cinema and television? I believe there is. Now, in cinema, even in its most experimental and post-dramatic forms, the hardest thing out of those three things, plot, character and world, the hardest thing to break apart or escape from is this world, is this assumed frame of a total coherent world. And heterogeneity, everything being different, is easily absorbable into homogeneity, the wholeness of a world. That's exactly what Soderbergh did in The Liming, right? He took the shots from Ken Loach, edited them in his own film, and suddenly they become part of his fictional world, not Loach's. Right? He rewrites those bits to fit his fictional world. It is very hard to achieve in film the theatrical post-dramatic goal of distinct pieces. Now, what I mean is this. Say we're watching a theatrical performance experimental piece. There's a bare stage. On one side of the stage, an actor comes in dressed in medieval costume, and they begin to recite a text from the medieval age. Suddenly, on the other side of the stage, Shakira makes a cameo appearance. Shakira starts singing her latest song. Now, if I'm watching that performance, I'm not thinking, oh, I've got it. Shakira is in a time machine and she's gone back to the medieval age in order to talk to this person, or the other way around, the person from the medieval age has taken a time machine because they really want to meet Shakira and hear a new track. You don't think that in the theatre, you just think here are two different things on the stage at once in the post-dramatic context. In a film, that's much, much harder to do. If in a film I cut from Shakira singing to the actor in medieval costume, your mind's going to be working overtime to figure out how do they connect. What is the world that connects these things? What's the plot? What's the connection that brings these two things together? And there are incredible examples of this, which I'll hopefully get to in my time with you today. Now, I'm going to show you an extraordinary example of what I'm talking about. The difficulty of breaking the illusion of a fictional world. It's in a Japanese film that perhaps none of you have ever heard of. Have any of you seen this film called Symbol, directed by Hitoshi Matsumoto? Nobody's seen Symbol? You've got to see Symbol. This film is absolutely amazing. Now let me tell you what it's all about, and I'm going to show you a clip from it. For 74 of its 90 minutes, Symbol appears to be two totally different films edited together. Sort of 10 minutes of one film, 10 minutes of the other. 10 minutes of one film, 10 minutes of the other. The first film is in Spanish with Japanese subtitles. It is the realistic portrait of a poor Mexican family in which the son gets ready for a major wrestling match. The son, you can just see in there, he's the guy with the green wrestling mask in the back. Right? So he's getting ready to do a big wrestling match. And this very realistic film, done in the style of Lisandro Alonso or something, is, he gets in the car with his mother, there's a long drive to the stadium, he's backstage in the stadium, he's getting ready to wrestle. So this is film number one. Film number two stars Matsumoto himself. He is a famous comedian in Japan, a bit like Takeshi Kitano, and he's in this film. Now, what is the second film? Matsumoto, a man, wakes up in a white room. No explanation. He wakes up in a white room in his pajamas, and he discovers that there are all these strange little things on the wall. In fact, they're little penises with testicles. All of those things are little penises with testicles. And then he realises that if he touches the penis, it makes a sound. Beep. And something happens. A door opens on the wall. Something falls from above. So he spends 74 minutes exploring this room. So you're going back and forth from this one film to the other. Now, any viewer, such as myself, when I first saw this film, I knew nothing about this film when I sat down to watch it, right? This is the best way to watch the film. Well, I'm spoiling that for you a little bit, but only a little bit, because there's a whole lot more that happens in this film that I'm going to tell you. So you're watching it, and you're thinking, okay, I've got it. I've got the dispositif of this film. We're just going to have two different films that are so different, cut together, alternated, right to the bitter end. There's no plot connection, there's no world connection, there's no character connection, but maybe there's a thematic or a symbolic connection. The film's got to be called Symbol for some reason, right? Symbolic connection. A person trying to win a wrestling match and a guy trying to get out of a room full of penises. That's not working, right? The symbolic interpretation is not coming to me, but I'm searching for it, right? This film's going past and I'm searching for what the possible connection between, symbolic connection between these two films can be. At the 70-minute point of the film, it's 90 minutes, remember, the 70-minute point of the film, there's this, begins very fast, cross-cutting between the wrestling match and the man in a room. It becomes faster, it becomes suspenseful in the way that Lehmann says. You want to know what's the outcome of this alternation, this rapid alternation, until something happens. And I'm now going to show you that something that happens. That's good. Maybe we'll turn the lights off for this clip. The lights are a bit brutal in this room.
Was that the very end of the film?
No, there's 15 more minutes of completely insane stuff after that. So I haven't spoiled the whole film for you by any means. The last 15 minutes are kind of rival Twin Peaks: The Return and 2001: A Space Odyssey for strangeness in the last 15 minutes. Now, I just need the full frame, which is there. Okay. Okay, so in Symbol by Matsumoto, the two stories have finally connected. It's a cosmic cause and effect. Whatever this guy does in White Room affects what happens in Mexico. Completely ridiculous, but wonderful. So the film is a trap for the spectator. You think you've worked it out, and then you haven't worked it out. So, my original question again, what do filmmakers mean when they talk about escaping, subverting, or destroying narrative? Now, there are two possible answers to this. Firstly, that they mean many different things. Second, that they don't have a clue what they mean. They don't know what they mean when they say, I want to destroy narrative, because they're not managing to destroy narrative. You know, they're pushing at its limits, they're playing with the pieces, they're moving the parts around, but they're not sort of breaking it. Now, I think if we take all of these comments that I've collected from filmmakers about their frustration with narrative, we can start to work out a model of actually what film narrative is. And this is not layman anymore, this is me. This is me trying to sort of project from what these filmmakers are saying. So, there are 7 things. The firstly is what I call a mode of content. Narratives, according to this projection, this model, narratives are linear, they are closed, they are predestined, they will always end in a foreshadowed way. Even if they are non-chronological, they are still linear, right? Even if Tarantino moves all the pieces of Pulp Fiction around, you can re-edit them back into a linear narrative. So, as Ventus said, that's what he found fatal about narrative. It will always end, the ending is always predestined. It's an imprisoning the structure. And usually, narratives are about individual humans. Hence Kolomoisky's joy when he said, I can get rid of the humans and just make a film about a donkey instead. In the mode of the form. Now, what I mean by that is that dramatic narrative is based on the exclusion of everything that is non-dramatic. So, no documentary part, no essay, like an Agnes Varda film, no collage, no diary. Now, of course, many filmmakers have made diary films, collage films, montage films, and so on. But that's not the kind of thing we're talking about here. We're talking about the directors who stick with narrative and find it hard to get out of it. So, hence Scorsese's desire. He doesn't want to make a straight narrative anymore. Well, he's been saying this for only about 40 years, so we'll see if he gets there. Now, in shape, remember Lehman's comment about exposition, development, crisis, and so on. In shape, narratives follow certain set rules of construction: conflict, exposition, climax, cause and effect. Right? Symbol by Matsumoto is a cause and effect joke. The cause in the White Room has an effect in the Mexican wrestling match. Cause and effect, outcome and suspense, delaying tactics. And hence, they are conventions. They become conventions that filmmakers feel they have to obey, they have to repeat, and therefore they repeat previous stories. And as Kolomoisky said, even if the plot is new, the shape is predictable. The 3-act structure, remember that was one of his frustrations. The 3-act structure is boring. Right, so the shape is predictable. It's boring. Now, in focus, narratives often ruthlessly narrow the angle or the range of what they are telling, of what they're showing. There's a hierarchy, right? You have your central character, your hero, and their subjective point of view. And then you've got all these secondary characters who are less important. And then you've got characters further out than that who are even less important. Now, if any of you have had the mishap of reading any of the 3,000 how to write a screenplay books, these manuals telling you how to write a Hollywood screenplay, this is their first rule. Concentrate on your hero. Concentrate on your main character. Stick with the point of view of your main character. Don't spend too much time with the secondary characters. Don't have too many characters. Right? All this garbage that's in all of these books, right? Totally conventional, dramatic stuff. So that's part of the hierarchy. In execution, now remember Soderbergh said that there's a grammar of filmmaking, a standard grammar, certain set ways of arranging a scene, of filming a scene. So starting with an establishing shot, coming in closer, doing shot, reverse shot on people talking, coming out again to a wider shot at the end. That's all conventional grammar of filming, right? Which Soderbergh himself tries to break in various ways, and then sometimes just gives up and goes back to the conventional way. This thing that I'm calling scene status, I'm going to come back to this. This is really important. It's the way films establish a certain level of artifice or believability. Like, if we're watching a musical and a character begins singing, we accept that as part of the musical genre, right? That's part of the believability of a musical. And so it's all about films establishing, for every event, for every scene that comes up, where does this scene come from? Where does it fit? So if there's a dream scene in a film, in a conventional film, we might see the character go to sleep, have a dream, wake up from the dream. So we know what the dream is, that it's a dream. Right? If a character has a flashback, there might be a close-up of their face, a bit of music, close-up of an object, we go into flashback and we return to the face of the person, right? So that's all conventional, what I call scene status. You know what the status of a scene is. And I'll come back to this because this is one of the most important parts of post-dramatic cinema, this possibility of questioning scene status. And finally, an obvious one, a kind of mode of spectator involvement. That we're gripped by the story, that we identify with the characters, we have empathy, or we have moral judgment. You know, if we're watching a Michael Haneke film, we have a moral judgment on the character. If we're watching a Claude Chabrol film, we have a moral judgment on all those terrible bourgeois people, you know, killing each other at home. So that's the emotional involvement. I won't say much more about that aspect today. So what have been some of the standard modernist responses? So modern art, modern cinema, modernist cinema, since, let's say, 1959, 1960. What have been some of the standard responses to these constraints of world, plot and character? Well, firstly, we've had a lot of non-chronological montage of taking the pieces, past, present and future, and moving them around. Films of Hélène René, of Nicholas Roeg, Richard Lester's Petulia, Stanley Donen's Two for the Road. These are examples from the 60s. Even the most conventional Hollywood filmmakers like Stanley Donen got into scrambling the chronology of the plots in the 60s. Then we have what I call these prismatic or mosaic structures, like in 11 Minutes by Skolimowski, where we see the same thing from different points of view. Tarantino, of course, is one of the lords of this trend, and he always talks about he plots the story and then he monkeys with the structure, meaning he plays, he moves it around, he moves the start and the end and the middle around. Right? He monkeys with the structure. 11 Minutes I've mentioned, Shane Carruth's film Upstream Colour is a particularly interesting example of one of these non-chronological films. So that's one response. Another response is to mix fiction and documentary. The work of Dusan Makaveyev, Robert Jude today, Alexander Kluger, some of the work of Strauss Pouillet, where we have fiction and documentary kind of butted up against each other. De-dramatisation and de-hierarchisation. So this is all about when you tell a story in a kind of a flat way, you don't have the hierarchy of characters, of the hero and the secondary, tertiary characters. You try to make everything kind of flat and even and equal. You get rid of the suspense and the high points of the drama and the low points of the drama. You try to put it on an even keel. Chantal Akerman, the famous Jean Dielman, is a perfect example of this, but also films by the Iranian director who worked in Germany, Shahid Saleh, Kelly Reichardt, works somewhat in this vein. The Kakistan director Ormabev, even Soderbergh made a film like this. It's actually one of his best films, Bubble, which is this film with completely flat emotional affect. It's as good, he should do more like that. Kiarostami is another director who sometimes you have no idea who the main character in a Kiarostami film is, because we start wandering off with another character that we thought was secondary but then becomes major. You know? So there's the hierarchy is questioned. Albert Serra is another filmmaker who works this way. There's the rise of what has been called refractory characters. And refractory characters are characters who are really, really hard to understand from a psychological point of view, and maybe you will never understand them. They're so enigmatic, they're so strange, their actions are so weird that you may never understand them. And one of the masters of this is Lucretia Martel. The film, for instance, The Headless Woman, is all about this refractory character. You just can't work her out. She can't work herself out. And many films are in this sphere of refractory characters. Another thing is what I think of as description of a milieu or a situation. And that's the opposite from plot progression. Instead of moving the plot forward, you sit with the social situation, with the situation of the characters, whatever it may be. You describe that milieu. You stay there and you stay with it. And a lot of what's called slow cinema is in this vein. Films by Eduardo Williams, Ulrich Seidel, Bela Tarr, Theo Angelopoulos, Simon Liang, who I'll mention again if I have time, and Apichat Pong. You know, often there's like half an hour where you'll just be sitting with a certain location like a hospital in Apichat Pong, and you'll explore all the rooms, all of the people in a hospital. And then finally there'll be one little plot move and it'll move on to something else. Of course, this I hardly need to mention this, but surrealism, the long and glorious history of surrealism in art and in film, anti-verisimilitude, anti-realism, super-realism, of course Buñuel, Jodorowsky, David Lynch, Marco Bellocchio is another fascinating example. It's interesting that in surreal filmmakers like Buñuel, how completely they went to the realm of the episodic. Like, you think of some of the last films of Buñuel, Milky Way, Discret Charm of the Bourgeoisie, Phantom of Liberty, they're all episodic. Like, one episode does not lead to another. They're all, it's like a mesh of different stories and different characters. In Discret Charm of the Bourgeoisie, you know, you keep coming back to this weird shot of the characters on a road, just walking on a road forever. You know, they're never going to get anywhere. They're never going to find a restaurant where they can eat a meal. All of those kinds of games in Buñuel. And then there's a sort of a more pop culture response, which I think of as a sort of comical pastiche, parody, satire, TV series and films that mix genres in a very merry, violent way. The films of Raoul Ruiz, many of his films fit this bill. The films of Joseph Kahn in America, such as Detention, a film I greatly recommend to you. The TV series Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, that some of you may love as much as I love. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend was a thing that, you know, totally blew up certain aspects of narrative. By the final episode, it all kind of got reined into the one fictional world. The work of Miki Takashi and, of course, Matsumoto's Single that we've seen a bit of. Now, the least theorised, and I think today most crucial category, is what I'm calling scene status. And let me go into this a bit more. Now, this is crucial for, as it were, post-dramatic filmmakers to work on. It's the most crucial to work on because this illusion of a coherent fictional world is so hard to evade in cinema. As I said before, you, the viewer, me, the viewer, will always connect any two things in a film and try to make them in our heads part of the same world. So it's very hard to escape the illusion of a coherent world. The strategy then becomes to create a kind of drift, a contamination of drift, of doubt, of ambiguity, of poetic mystery within the givens of the diegesis of the world, of the fictional world, plot, character and world, trying to put doubt in there. So when Boulanger, the actor, says that she plays more and less than the character, that's her way of drifting away from the role script, right? To subtract the psychology and to add the stereotype. That's her way of drifting off from her job, as it were, her given job. So this is all about subverting narrative from within, right? It's not about absolutely negating it. It's not about absolutely destroying it. It's about telling a story but making it strange from within. So it's like these moments when we're unable to determine in the moment that we're viewing it or ever after, we are unable to determine the status of a scene within the fiction's given levels. So I said before that in very ordinary films, you know when a character is dreaming, you know when a character is having a flashback. What I'm talking about now are the kinds of films where you're watching a scene and you don't know whether it's a dream or not. You don't know whether it's a memory flashback or not. It could be, it might not be. And there's nothing in the film that is definitely nailing this down for you, right? One of my favourite examples of this is the French director Philippe Garrel, one of my favourite filmmakers. And in one of his recent films, it's the one called Lover for a Day, he gave an interview where he said, well, you know, I often use my dreams, like Garrel's own dreams. I often use my own dreams. And I do scenes based on my dreams. And the interviewer said, oh, that's very interesting, but you didn't do that in your latest film, Lover for a Day. And he said, yes, I did. There are 3 scenes in the film which are dreams, but I'm not telling you what they are. Isn't that great? I had to watch the film again to even begin to work out what he meant by this, right? And then, yes, strange things begin. Perhaps that scene of sex between those characters, they didn't really have sex. It's kind of Garrel's dream of those 2 characters having sex. Or it's one of the characters' dreams. Or it's something else, right? So it's when all of these sort of undecidable options begin to generate. Scenes become apparitions, what I call undecidable apparitions. They appear and you don't know what status they have exactly. And even the category of authorial artistic invention. Here I'm drawing on David Bordwell's theory of art cinema narration, as he calls it. And Bordwell talks about, for instance, symbolic shots, where, as it were, the director himself or herself declares their hand. Like you're watching a film and you're watching 2 characters manoeuvring, and then suddenly there's a close-up, an insert close-up of a spider spinning a web. And you go, ah, yes, I see the symbolism. These characters are spinning a web of intrigue with each other, right? That's what Bordwell says is a typical authorial statement. You know, the author says, here's a metaphor for you. Here's a symbol for you. But in what I'm talking about, it's really hard to know when things are symbols or metaphors or not. In the films of Bellocchio, in his recent TV series, one of the most interesting TV series I've ever seen, Exterior 9, there's a whole thing in this film about a politician who's obsessed with the map of Italy. And there's a moment in the film where he walks past the map and suddenly he runs back and stares at it, and the map is bleeding. The map of Italy is bleeding. And then it just goes to the next scene. There's no realistic explanation of this at all, right? It's an apparition that hits us as well as hitting the character, of course. Now, I want to refer to a recent sort of helpful theory of fiction. It certainly helped me in thinking about these issues. It comes from a number of different authors that I'm putting together, such as Gary Saul Mawson, the Australian-Russian philosopher theorist Julia Vassilieva, who I particularly recommend her work to you, and René Audet. And what they've developed, sort of as it were between them, or me sort of reading between them, what they've developed is a theory of fiction which says that a fiction can be thought of as a machine that generates possible scenes. or virtual scenes. In other words, it's the story of a man and woman, and maybe they die, maybe they live, maybe they meet, maybe they part. And we're going to see all these different variations, but not within a framework where the characters sit and say, oh, what would it be like if we never met? And then we see that, right? We just see that. We just see these different options appearing, apparitions on the screen. So there's no fixed story. There is a semblance of a story, there are elements of a story, there are elements of characters, perhaps, there's elements of a world, but there's no fixed story. The characters are shifting in intriguing ways, and it's a dynamic, or what I call a provisional world. And I'll give a few more examples to make this clearer. And so the dramatic, as the opposite of the post-dramatic in layman's terms, the dramatic is all about fatalism, determinism, fixed time, right? This conference theme of time and temporality. In the classical sense, you know, narrative is always a fixed and determined time. And even in Matsumoto's symbol, of course, finally everything is determined. Everything is determined by a guy, you know, hitting those little penises in a room and making those little boop boop sounds. Now, the other side of that, the different opposite of that, is what these theorists call tempic narrative. For them, tempic is the opposite of poetic. I won't get into all of their definitions, but let's say tempic narrative is like post-dramatic narrative. And tempic narrative is conditional and it's speculative. It's the realm of the unstable, the unpredictable, the unfinished, and the unresolved. Julia Vassilieva has a brilliant metaphor. She says, you know, think of your computer, think of your files in the digital cloud. And she says the films and TV series that work on this principle have a narrative cloud. There's a narrative cloud where all the possibilities exist, and some of them rain down into the film. Right? So that's the kind of open system of the narrative cloud. And one of the examples, which Miguel has mentioned in his talk, is Mysteries of Lisbon, the wonderful TV series by Raul Ruiz. And I do insist that you watch the TV series and not the feature film that was edited from the series. Because in fact, Raul took out the best part of the series when he made the film, when he re-edited the film version. But when you watch the entire 6 episodes of the TV series, you totally get what Vassilieva is talking about, of the narrative cloud. And you know, it's a thing that many contemporary TV series play with, is that, you know, you watched it last week, and now this week's episode starts. And it starts somewhere that you didn't predict. It starts in the past, it starts with some other character. Eventually, of course, that past and that character will join the world of the film. In Raul Ruiz's work, it's never so clear, right? You know, we start somewhere new and we think, where the hell are we now? You know? And when are we ever going to get back to that other storyline? And maybe never is the answer. Right? And Raul, who I knew a little bit personally, he once said to me, the great thing about television is that you can do something in episode 1 of a series and you can finally get back to it in episode 30. You know, you can let it just suspend itself for a long, long, long time until most viewers have forgotten it. And then you can bring it back, right, in a really weird and unusual way. Now, one application of this idea I'm talking about, of speculative narrative, is this idea that a film is a kind of brain or a mind. You know, it's sort of a speculative idea to think of it this way. A film is an unconscious mind. It's not a conscious mind. A lot of the problems I have with, for instance, intertextual theory is that it's also bloody conscious. It's like the Coen brothers quote this and Scorsese quotes that, and Tarantino knows because he's seen everything, he's quoting that. And who gives a damn what they've seen and what they know and what they quote? What's more interesting is when you don't know what you're quoting, when it's coming from your unconscious, right? That's what Alain Bergler, who got mentioned in an earlier presentation, Bergler calls creative reminiscence. When you don't know exactly what you're quoting, you don't know what it is you remember. It's something there. back in your mind, and you remake it, you recreate it through your unconscious memory. So this is a metaphor to say that a film can be considered an unconscious mind, and it dreams itself. It dreams its fiction, bit by bit, in this disconnected way. Examples of that are Olivier Assayas's original film of Irma Vep, Christy Puey's Malmkrog, Simon Liang's Stray Dogs, a film which I want to say a little more about if I have time, David Lynch's Inland Empire, which is certainly his most radical work on fiction, more radical than Twin Peaks: The Return, finally. Many films by Alain Resnais and of Yvonne Rainer, the American dancer, choreographer, artist who became a filmmaker. In the case of Alain Resnais, for instance, he took speculative fiction to the point where, you know, he made two films that are twin films. One's called Smoking and the other's called No Smoking. And Smoking starts with a character who walks out on her balcony and lights up a cigarette. And then the whole plot goes from that. Then he made the companion film, feature film, called No Smoking, in which the character walks out on the balcony, starts to light a cigarette, and then there's none. And we get a totally different plot that then goes from that moment, right? And when that was first shown in Paris, first released, it was two cinemas, two posters, and then the two films played in two rooms, like next to each other. You could go see Smoking, and then you could go see No Smoking, or the other way around, right? And this is good, right? This is good when Resnais can get money to do things like this, right? With commercial French stars and all the rest of it. Now, I'm going to, I think, now, how much more time have I got to speak? The suspense is on?
15 minutes plus slide.
15 minutes? Okay. I think I'm going to skip a little bit what I was going to say about Ingmar Bergman, who is an extremely interesting case, but I'll just tell you that one of the points that Lehman makes is that the modern theatre, the new theatre, can often go back in time and find these predecessors for post-drama, these earlier forms that were not exactly dramatic. And one of these is symbolist theatre, which is incredibly influential on Ingmar Bergman's films. Symbolist theatre, lyric drama, static drama of the late 19th century, which Lehman said is part of a series of stages of self-reflection, decomposition and separation of the elements of dramatic theatre. Renounced is the construction of tension, drama, story and imitation. So we're talking about 1900 here, right? We're talking about the year 1900, where some plays, some writers, some theatrical groups are doing this. August Strindberg, in his preface to A Dream Play, which was an obsession of Bergman's, in the 1901 preface to A Dream Play, he says, "The characters split, double, multiply, evaporate, condense, dissolve and merge." Isn't that great? The characters do all that, but one consciousness rules them all, the dreamers. For him there are no secrets, no inconsistencies, no scruples and no laws. There's no law of the unconscious. Right? Now what's great about that is that the dreamer doesn't have to be a character, right? The dreamer can be the author, the dreamer can be the audience, the dreamer can be the work itself. So that was an early vision of this kind of scene status questioning that I'm talking about. So here, when Strindberg says the characters can merge and split and multiply, it's not the model of individually defined psychology that is at the basis of dramatic acting, right? It's not an actor saying, I am playing Adrian, and Adrian has these characteristics, and he dresses this way, and he speaks this way, and I'm going to be Adrian, right? What this kind of drama is about, this symbolist drama, is in fact characters more like phantoms. One becomes another. One reflects another, right? And it's very hard to get some actors to understand this, right? Because actors are so used to, I am playing that individual, and I am that individual now. But this is another mode of acting, the more or less, more than a character, less than a character. Constantly the actor becomes a constantly changing vessel for states, for phantoms, for configurations of characters. And I'm going to skip a few things here. I won't talk at length about Persona. It's a film I'm sure some of you know, one of the greatest films by Bergman, and it is his most experimental film in this direction. A Dream Play by Strindberg was an obsession of his. The dream scenes are unbound. In other words, you never know when a dream begins or ends in Persona, right? He doesn't give you the usual beginning and ending and intro and outro points. Buñuel does that a lot. David Cronenberg does that a lot in his work. Persona was based on the mystery of friendship between women as he observed it, as Bergman observed it, and how there was no fixed identity between two people in a friendship. It's been said of Bergman's cinema, it is less drama than dramatic essay. It is less representation than a probing of representability, meaning what can be represented, what could be represented, what's not being represented. Right? It's a probing of representability. It's less storytelling than an arrangement of optional, notional scenes that might or might not add up to a coherent story. And that brilliant quote, by the way, was written by me. And Bergman used minimalist techniques of theatre to draw a film away from realism. Now, I'm getting near to the end now. Now, there are two problems I'm going to mention to you, which will allow me to tell you a few stories. Now, the problem is the tendency of critics, sometimes of academic scholars, of ordinary filmgoers, the tendency to interpret tempic or post-dramatic cinema in conventional dramatic terms. Let me give you an example. A number of filmmakers have done the experiment where you have a character played by multiple actors, right? One character played by multiple actors. One of the most famous examples, the top pictures, is Buñuel's That Obscure Object of Desire, where the main woman character is played by Anne-Hélène Molina and Carole Bouquet. Totally different women who look totally different, one Spanish, one French, they're different in every way. The co-writer of the film, Jean-Claude Carrière, a very great screenwriter and thinker, he loved to tell the story, which in fact really depressed him, that when the film was released, when it was a big success in 1976, whatever, he had a celebration dinner with his friends to celebrate the success of the film, and he said to them, wasn't that Buñuel's greatest idea, to have two different women play the one character? And his friends said to him, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? There's only one woman. And Carrière said, no, there are two women. There are two women, they switch from scene to scene, and sometimes they switch in the middle of a scene, in the middle of a dialogue. And the friends said, you're nuts, you're having a joke on us. There's only one woman in the film. And Carrière said, well, who is that woman? Oh, we don't know her name, but she brought out the different sides of that character so well. The Spanish and the French side. And Carrière said for him, this was very depressing proof that no matter what you give an audience, they're going to read it in a conventional dramatic way. They're going to make a coherent sense of it when there is no coherent sense of it. An even more extraordinary example is a film by Simon Liang called Stray Dogs, made in 2015. And that's the bottom two stills. Now in this film, there's a man with two small children. We assume he's the father of two children. And then there are encounters with a female figure. I use that word very definitely, figure, because she's played by three women. This one, who you probably can tell is relatively young. This one over here, who's much older, much older. I can show you articles about Stray Dogs written by really some of the top people. David Baldwin, Yvette Bureau, a brilliant screenwriting teacher. And Yvette's article, I mean, God knows I love Yvette and I've published a lot of Yvette's work, but Yvette wrote an article on this film in which she says, a man and his two children remember their dead mother They have flashbacks to their dead mother. And David Bordwell says there's this mother who appears in one scene and another. Neither of them realise that there are three actresses playing the character. And nor did they realise that there is nothing like a conventional narrative chain in this film. It's like a series of performance art pieces. Sometimes with the children, sometimes with a woman, sometimes with the man. And they are the optional scenes that Sy plays out. And Sy actually began with a script written by two other writers that was handed to him. And he said his work as the director was to get rid of the story bit by bit, to get rid of the plot, to get rid of the narrative connection between the scenes, to totally de-plot the film, and also to de-world the film, because it's really like Juan was quoting before, that quote from Ascari, an aesthetics of ruin, of ejection, of horror and so on. And that's what Stray Dogs is. It's like a series of ruins in which these characters find themselves, refrigerators, out in the rain, in a hovel. You have no idea how, there's no logic to how they get from one, they're not getting from one place to another. It's Sy imagining these scenes with the characters, but that doesn't stop film reviewers thinking it's a perfectly conventional story about a father and mother and two children. I'm going to tell two more stories. One of them is about a very, very interesting post-dramatic artist, performance artist named Lyndall Jones, who is a friend of mine in Australia. That post-dramatic theatre in one picture, right there, right? A slide with a text, the writing is on the wall, an actor who never speaks, who never moves, who's blindfolded against the wall, a set which you can walk around. If you're a spectator, you can walk around and look at the books, you can read the texts, and there's other stuff going on in the space. So that's a typical post-dramatic performance piece by Lyndall Jones. Now, Lyndall's work is very much inspired by and based on the work of Yvonne Rainer, the American artist. And Rainer's original success came from minimalist dance. And she did a very famous dance piece called Trio A. And Trio A is just a series of very basic movements, like balancing on one foot and then on the other, moving an arm, turning. But no facial expression, no narrative, no world, and no plot, right? Just a series of inexpressive, graceful, hypnotic, but not expressive movements. It's not expressive lyrical dance, right? It's minimal dance. It's minimalistic dance. Lyndall, very inspired by Yvonne Rainer. When I first met Lyndall, she was teaching students theatre. She was teaching them post-dramatic theatre. And she was teaching them how to do things like Yvonne Rainer did them. So Lyndall would have an exercise where her acting students would sort of line up around the walls. And when they would move, and when one got into that corner and one got into that corner, they would have to move towards each other. And then, when they approach, each person has to make a decision. Are they going to collide? Is one going to move off? Is the other going to move off? Are they both going to move off? And she would have the students in a rotation, right? Constantly doing this. In fact, it's very much like a scene from Act One. It's like one of the theatre rehearsals in Act One. Absolutely marvellous to watch. I watched one of these performances of Lyndall's students. There's no world, there's no plot, there's, whatever, but it's a hypnotic kind of gestural spectacle of bodies. Anyway, Lyndall taught their students, and the students went off and became teachers of teenagers in secondary school. And Lyndall got an invitation from her former students. She said, these former students said, we have taken everything you've taught us and we have done a work with teenagers. We've done minimalist dance with teenagers. And Lyndall was so happy, right? Wow, how fantastic. Yvonne Rainer reaches 14-year-olds. This is amazing. And I was there with Lyndall the night that we saw this student performance. Here's what it was. A bare stage, just a few lights, a few kids, students teenagers, kind of slumped on the floor. And then finally some spooky music starts. And then suddenly a light comes on and a sign comes on. Mental asylum. Like home for the mentally sick. And then all of these students, looking like zombies, start walking towards each other from each corner and falling on the ground. And the music gets spookier, and so they took everything that Lyndall did and turned it into a story about madness. Minimalist dance is madness. And they did this, they gave it a world, they gave it a story, they gave it a meaning, pretty bloody stupid meaning. And Lyndall was devastated. It's like, is this what I taught them, you know? Is this what they learnt from years of post-dramatic training? You know, they just recoded everything back into the dramatic. They recoded the post-dramatic back into the dramatic. And I won't have time to show this now, but I just want to say that if you've seen, or you will see, EO by Skolimowski, there's an incredible scene in that where it's suddenly a robot. That's a little robot. It's just a scene of a robot moving. And before that is a scene in which EO is beaten by some guys. And after it is a scene of EO in an animal hospital. Right? Now, I've read so many reviews of this film that say EO the donkey is dreaming of a robot. And he's dreaming of recovering his motor skills. Now, this is pretty nuts, right? I mean, why would a donkey be dreaming of a robot? It's not the point, right? It's that Skolimowski decides in a film about various kinds of living creatures, human and animal, he decides to introduce machine, right? Robot. So part of the narrative cloud of the film is, let's have a scene with a robot. It has nothing to do with the rest of the film. There's no robot character in the film. The robot never appears again. You could say, this is the donkey dreaming, but you'd be kind of pretty silly to say that. No, it's Skolimowski dreaming, or it's the film dreaming about all of its different speculative options. I'm going to end on this point that, in a way, the problem with us negotiating the dramatic and the post-dramatic, it all starts with plot synopsis, what's called in English the log line. I mean, I write, for instance, for catalogues for film festivals, and I always am told to do this, and I always want to revolt, because I have to put the film in a sentence, in 2 lines. And log lines, synopses are everywhere, right? They're in publicity, they're on the back of the DVD, in streaming, right? If you're streaming Netflix or whatever, you're going to get the log line. Log lines like this: persona, a nurse and an actress become psychologically entangled in a clinic and then at a summer house. What an exciting plot. EO, a donkey's harsh life, from birth to death. Stray dogs. A homeless man moves around Taipei with his 2 small children, sometimes encountering an enigmatic woman. That one was hard to put in a log line, right? So you get these absurd sort of things. And my final word of very practical advice to you is stop reading synopses. Stop writing synopses. Stop talking synopses. When your best friend asks you, oh, what's that film about? Oh, it's about a man and a woman in a jungle, and, you know, don't do it. Just try not to do it, because if we start with a synopsis, we start with the reduction to plot, character and world, and then it's real hard to move from there. Okay, thanks very much.